Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Hart Square webinar on GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And the title of our webinar today is Get Ready for GDPR, How to Assess Your Readiness and What Does It Mean for the Third Sector. Let's begin by introducing ourselves. I'm Helen McGrath from Hart Square, and we help a range of organisations, both in the charity sector and among membership bodies, with their CRM and website projects, and increasingly that means GDPR too.
Alan Reid, Director of Client Projects at Hart Square. I've been helping organisations with data security, the Data Protection Act, and more recently the GDPR most of my working life.
And I'm Chris Gilbert. I'm a senior CRM consultant, and I've been with Hart Square for about 5 years and within the sector for about 15.
Okay, thanks Alan and Chris. So if you would like to get in touch with us, we would welcome any questions about GDPR and the content of this webinar. You can email us at gdpr@hartsquare.co.uk and we will respond to you following the webinar. Before we begin, a quick note to say that we've developed a range of free resources specifically for the NFP sector, which are all available through our website, including a white paper that outlines GDPR and why it matters, some FAQs that we've found many of our clients asking, and a self-assessment form that we will go into later. The site also includes an overview of what our CRM technology partners are saying about GDPR. This is all available through our website, hartsquare.co.uk/GDPR, which is shown at the bottom of each of our slides. You'll also notice a link to the TechSmart event, which we will touch on later, where we will be running a roundtable discussion and offering one-to-one consultations. Now that the free stuff is out of the way, I'll take a moment to explain this webinar. We will begin by tackling head-on the question of what this means for the third sector, the opportunities as well as the challenges, and how some of the underlying concepts apply specifically to you. We will then consider GDPR as a regime to untangle it and clarify it as a concept. Finally, we will look at some of the next steps you can take and how Hart Square can help you to plan for the coming months. With that, I'll hand over to Alan to take us through what GDPR means for the third sector.
Great, thanks Helen. So one of the first things to say is that GDPR has not been designed to prevent charities from raising funds or promoting their cause, or to restrict membership bodies from sharing relevant and valuable information with their members and industry professionals. It's not an attack on non-profits, but it is an overdue modernisation of data protection regulations to ensure that the personal information being recorded and processed is appropriately captured, stored securely, and used with respect for each individual's right to privacy. In the past few years, there have been some really high-profile incidents which have damaged the reputation of charity fundraisers in particular. GDPR provides a good opportunity to improve the public image of the sector and of fundraisers in executing their role. For membership bodies, you could say that many have taken a relatively complacent approach to the Data Protection Act, on the basis that membership entails a relationship where you can pretty much do what you like in terms of communicating with people. When it comes to the GDPR, you're obliged to be far more active in how you process and manage your data and how you record how you intend to use it on a case-by-case basis. From our experience with non-profit organisations, we do see that they can be natural hoarders of information, seeking to capture and store as much as possible in expectation that the more they know, the better they can communicate. But the reality is that a lot of this data remains untouched and after initial capture, neglected and full of errors. Often this is due to shortfalls either with the technology or with the culture within the organisation and how people work together, meaning that personal information is not regularly updated or stewarded. With many of our clients, this is a known challenge, and most of aspirations to improve data quality is part of the work we undertake with them. So yes, GDPR means it's time to get our house in order, but the actions required are really positive. Done properly, they'll improve effectiveness to the benefit of members, supporters, and donors. So there's a lot written about GDPR and what it means, and it would be possible to spend the next 6 months reading about nothing else without necessarily getting much clarity. What is clear that there are some key concepts enshrined in GDPR which we have described for non-profits. These principles serve as the guidepost telling us what we need to do to achieve compliance. They're really very simple and they are as follows. 1, understanding. 2, record keeping. and 3, transparency. And we'll explore those in a little more detail now. So if we talk about the first key concept, what we're talking about is understanding. So first of all, understanding by your organization of the information you need to hold, what is personal identifiable information, where you store it and how you use it. Secondly, understanding by your staff of the information they need and don't need, and where they're allowed to store it and what they're allowed to do with it, plus what they are to say to anyone who asks and who to go to if they have any questions or issues. And thirdly, by your members as donors of the information that you hold, why you hold it, and what you intend to do with it, and what to do if they object. So before I get into record keeping and transparency, the second 2 principles, I just wanted to ask Helen to explain a little bit more about a key concept, which is personal identifiable information. It's an area where there are a lot of questions. So Helen, please.
Yes, so personal data means roughly the same thing as it did under the Data Protection Act. It's any information relating to a person that allows you to identify that person. So it could be a name or some kind of ID or a description like the woman with the cough in Manchester. The GDPR goes further than the DPA did by also including things like IP addresses or other online identifiers, which reflects this attempt to modernise data protection law.
Great, thank you. So this takes us to the second key principle, which is record keeping. So one of the key differences between the old Data Protection Act and the modern GDPR is that you are obligated to be much more active in how you keep and record your records. So essentially, most organizations will need to keep a GDPR folder, whether electronic or even a ring binder, that just shows that they have gone through the process of thinking about how they store and manage data. So you're obliged to record centrally how your records are created and kept. You need to document what you're holding, why you're holding it, what you intend to use it for, on what lawful basis you're recording it and processing it. You need to ensure that you've got documented clarity as well, that your processes for managing data are auditable, that you're able to show someone on request that you've thought about it and you've clarified it to your staff. So all of those key things oblige you to be active and take steps, not just to be passive, as with the old Data Protection Act. What you can see now is that the third obligation is for you to be transparent. It's an absolutely key fundamental of the GDPR that you're obliged to be open, honest, and transparent to develop trusted relationships. Whether you use personal information, wherever you use it, you must give clear, simple, standalone statements describing why you've processed it and how to opt out, unsubscribe, or even object to the organization using it. So you can see on screen now a sample statement that you should be publishing, the kind of thing you should publish on relevant data collection forms. So it isn't exactly what you would say, but it's a good example that it guarantees compliance, and it's certainly the sort of thing that you should be considering. Then, of course, you can see that there's a click here option on that statement, which gives you more detail. So if you're a member or a potential supporter, you're able to get much more detail about what the GDPR implications of this, what the implications to your privacy are with this organization and this form that you're filling in. So the privacy notice really speaks to the legitimate interest basis. That is to emphasize again that it's a fundamental area which non-profits need to understand and determine how to use appropriately. It's a critical aspect of GDPR for you both in terms of enabling you to operate and to ensure that you don't abuse the legitimate interest provision. So if we talk about legitimate interest, essentially it's a clearly articulated benefit to your single company or society as a whole. You can't have untrammeled legitimate interest limitations. So it's except where such interests are overridden by the interests of fundamental rights of the subject, typically the rights to freedom, to privacy. It also takes into consideration the reasonable expectation that data subjects will have based on their relationship to you, the controller. And it must be documented. You can't just talk about it in the event of a complaint. You must have preemptively documented your lawful basis for keeping data and what the balancing test is for that data within your organization. Then, of course, the fact that somebody objects to your managing of their data is enough to change the balance between legitimate interest and consent. For a membership body or a charity, legitimate interest is usually the most appropriate lawful basis on which to communicate with members and supporters. Therefore, those members and supporters have an expectation of their data being processed and being that you will communicate with them directly. However, the second lawful basis, which is key for you, is consent. So we talked about that a little earlier, and I think we largely understand the concept of active consent when people are filling in data forms, opting in and opting out. But the biggest immediate challenge where consent is concerned is how this applies with respect to old data or existing information, and whether new consent needs to be sought before we can use it. So just on that question, I'm going to ask Chris to comment, if I may.
So the act of repermissioning can take several forms, be it through phone, email or postal channels, but there may be greater need to do this in some areas than others. Assessing how your current data sets align with GDPR's framework requires you to think about the statements provided to your contacts in the past and whether you can demonstrate what they were told at the time. So logging these and being able to prove the conditions under which someone provided their details to you is absolutely vital. So this needs investigation across not just your central system, if you have one, but also across your website and other systems such as campaigning tools, Excel spreadsheets and access databases, anything that's capturing that level of information. If you can review that information and be confident that there has been a consistency of approach and the details recorded within the system were accurately and appropriately captured and can evidence that, then repermissioning may not be needed at this time. However, if you look at sensitive data held or statements which mix opt-ins and opt-outs and find any evidence of that data having been inconsistently imported or recorded, you should seriously consider a repermissioning exercise takes place. Based on some other recent projects we've been involved in, it's safe to say that where there has been some doubt, they have carried out a repermissioning exercise to ensure that this doesn't come back to bite them in future.
So thanks, Chris. So to summarize, based on what we see and do every day, we know that for non-profits, a key strategic objective is to improve communications, engagement and impact. These are challenges which are all actually supported by improving your compliance with the GDPR. The things that you need to do in order to be compliant are the things that are going to enable you to be more personalized, relevant, and get better traction when engaging with your members and supporters. So it's really important that you ask yourself, as part of a GDPR preparation, firstly, what data do we hold? Where did it come from? Where is it stored? How do we manage it? How do we use it? And once you understand that across your enterprise and your different teams and your different data sources, you really then need to understand what data do we need to hold. So don't just presume because you've always captured it that you need to hold it and it's not going to cause you a problem in future. What local basis you're going to justify the capture and the processing of this information under. You need to then refresh your view of where it's stored, how it's going to be managed, and how you are legitimately allowed to use it. These questions need to be looked at afresh. So, as well as looking at these things, you need to document it. One of the clear understandings for non-profits under the GDPR is that you need to actively document the process you go through so that in the event of a complaint, in the event of a subject access request, that you're able to show that you have got processes, that you have thought about these things, and you have prepared your organization for GDPR.
Thanks.
So I'll just hand over to Helen, if I may.
Lovely. Thanks, Alan. In this section, I'll run through GDPR as a regime in order to provide some context to the subject. First of all, I think it's useful to consider how we've arrived at GDPR. The current regime, the 1998 Data Protection Act, or DPA, arose out of a growing concern about changes to the way that technology was being used to handle data. Of course, since '98, we've witnessed a technology revolution. The growth of the internet, mobile technology, and our access to information on the go has changed the way people provide their data, changed the way that people demand services, and changed the way we all work, all of which has driven the development of a substantial digital economy. Many people are happy to provide their data in order to get beneficial services that are relevant to them, but believe their privacy needs to be respected. and their data use restricted and not taken for granted. GDPR builds on the DPA by giving individuals further rights and adding responsibilities on organisations to have robust data policies and processes. It's an opportunity to build trust with your supporters and to continue enhancing your services, and a chance to build a culture of respect for data protection within your organisation. Superficial policies that employees overlook by taking personal data home with them or putting it into a public cloud drives will leave your organisation exposed. Finally, it's important to avoid falling short of your GDPR responsibilities. The media attention that will likely follow organisations that fall short and get hit with a minimum £10 million fine will raise public awareness and increase inquiries to your organisations from people that have received yet another email from you. So, to a quick overview of GDPR. If you are currently affected by DPA, you are almost certainly going to be affected by GDPR. If you handle or process personal data in the EU, including the UK, this will mean you. GDPR applies to personal data and especially sensitive personal data. This is like the DPA, but extends to things like IP addresses, genetic and biometric information. Finally, the deadline for compliance is the 25th of May 2018, and the onus is on your organisation taking steps now to be ready for that deadline. So, how should you organise your thinking about GDPR? There's been a lot of chatter on GDPR, and the grapevine tends to complicate the issues, plus the ICO's documents are often unwieldy. I think the starting point is understanding the 6 principles your organisation needs to comply with, which are shown on the slide now. First, the idea that personal data needs to be processed in a way, which I will explore in the next slide. It needs to be fairly and transparently processed so you are clear with your data subjects exactly how you are processing the information. Secondly, it needs to be collected for specified purposes and not used for anything else. Relevant information should be collected and used for the specified purpose only. The information needs to be accurate and up to date. It must be anonymised once the processing that you require for it is no longer necessary or needed. And finally, it needs to be processed to ensure you are properly secure with the personal data. There are 6 different bases on which to justify processing, and these are shown on the slide. One that might be less clear is vital interests, which refers where you need the data to protect life. The 2 that we feel are most important to the third sector are consent and legitimate interests. Chris, I know we were talking the other day about consent and about how much interest there's been about this amongst our clients.
Yeah, so I think consent is possibly one of the hottest topics we've seen discussed, counted and picked apart since the first pieces of information regarding GDPR were circulated. The ICO have now provided much clearer guidance in this area and proposes that an opt-in model without pre-tick boxes be the favoured approach to consent, which we at Hart Square do believe is the fairest and the clearest method of engaging with your current and future supporters, members, etc. In the past, consent was riddled with confusion because there were so many different approaches to opt-ins and opt-outs, pre-tick boxes, mixed statements where one item said opt-in whilst another opt-out. We've all been in positions of completing forms by hand or online in the past where we feel that either through lack of thought or an intentional attempt to mislead us, these choices have been unclear and muddled. That does nothing but make you question what the organisation is trying to do with your information and the requirements of GDPR to not bury the details of how your data will be used in endless T's and C's, and to clearly identify the options available to you to hear more or less about certain areas of the organisation you're connecting with does seem sensible and fair. At its simplest, consent under GDPR is all about being fair, open and transparent about what you intend to do with someone's information, putting the individual in control and ensuring that you respect who they are and how they wish to engage with you. It's a great opportunity to build trust and an ongoing relationship.
Thanks, Chris. Absolutely. And the idea of building trust goes to the heart of the opportunity that we see GDPR presenting. Alan, equally, legitimate interest has raised a lot of discussion in the sector as well, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And it's one of the lawful bases under which we can process data as an alternative to consent. But it's also one of the most frequently asked questions about what people are and are not allowed to do. So let's talk about the really important things around legitimate interest. So first of all, it has to be explicitly identified as your lawful basis for processing personal information. So you have to have a track record, an audit trail of saying this is how and why we are processing this particular set of information. You then need to explain that in a way that can be presented to anyone in the event of an audit, and then you have to record that you pay due account to the rights of the individual and have determined that they are protected. It can't just be all about you. You have to clearly state that this is your lawful basis and allow individuals to object to it. The difference between consent and legitimate interest as a lawful basis is really in how it affects the fundamental rights of the individual. So if we can use a couple of examples to illustrate this. So firstly, if you process an individual's data under consent and they invoke their right to erasure, then you're obliged to stop processing it immediately and in fact to erase it. If you process their data under legitimate interest and they invoke their right to erasure, they can object at any time and you are permitted to attempt to defend your position. So there's a significant difference which you should remember when assessing which lawful basis you're going to cite when processing personal data. Secondly, you're relying on legitimate interest for your profiling activities. The individual has a right to object to profiling under Article 21 of the GDPR. But if you're using consent for your profiling activities, the individual doesn't have a right to object, although they can withdraw their consent at any time. So therefore, on balance, you may wish to rely on legitimate interest rather than consent, as you have the opportunity to defend this decision, whereas with consent, once it's withdrawn, processing must cease immediately. So what we have is I'd like to emphasize that the overview of the GDPR is going to be explained in more detail by Helen.
Great, lovely. Thanks very much, Alan. So, in addition to respecting principles, organisations have to respect the rights of individuals, which are shown on the screen. Two that are worth clarifying are data portability and the last point about decision making and profiling. Data portability is the right to have their data extracted from your databases in order that it can be provided to an alternative service provider. The right about automatic decision making is essentially the right to have human oversight of potentially damaging decisions taken through some automatic process. Finally, and arguably the most important change with GDPR, is the need to go beyond being compliant. You must demonstrate compliance. That is the need to maintain records and to be accountable. To achieve the required level of accountability, there are governance processes to adhere to, particularly in relation to data protection officers and in reporting data breaches within 72 hours. Okay, that's a cook's tour of GDPR. Hopefully it's provided some orientation to the key concepts. I'll hand over to Chris, who will lead us through the next steps to consider.
Okay, so what we're going to be looking at next is Hart Square's self-assessment, and we're looking at areas of why we're providing it, what is it, how do I use it, and what do I do afterwards. So, why are we providing this? Too many top tips, email newsletters and seminars, but without a specific NFP focus or only in certain areas. We know the challenges organisations in the sector face, the tight resources, the confusion and panic, not being clear what to do next. And we do feel that we have the insight and the knowledge to help. That's something that Alan is now going to talk about briefly.
Thanks, Chris. So as you say, we're seeing an absolute overload of information being created and shared in respect of GDPR, most of which is naturally generic and repetitive. So what we want to do is look at the information that's required for the NFP sector. We spend our lives delivering projects for membership organisations and charities, and essentially we want to make sure that those organisations are made ready and prepared for what they need to do under GDPR. So with this in mind, we looked at the information being shared, and we thought that it would be beneficial to create charity-specific and membership body-specific information of what you need to do and what your next steps are. I think we're clear that GDPR can't be ignored, it can't be outsourced, you can't avoid it. It's a reality that we have to address. And we feel there's a lot of information being circulated, but there's not enough to say, this is what you need to do. So that's what we're setting out to do, to ensure that the non-profit sector is aware of how you achieve compliance and what you need to do to make sure that you don't have difficulties under GDPR.
Okay, and the final point is that we want to create a better sector. We do love and care about this sector, and we hate seeing its reputation being dragged down in the press. But we also know that organisations have made bad decisions or not thought clearly about their approach and caused some of their own problems. We all need to help one another to share the knowledge and provide a better service, insight and interactions to the people that we work with and for. So what is it? The self-assessment is split into 5 key areas, and we'll talk through those now. So GDPR in your organisation, your communications to staff internally and the work undertaken to maintain good practice from May onwards are covered in this section. So this is your data officers, inductions for new staff and your overall strategic approach. Next is collecting data, how you collect information across what sources, how consistently you do this and how well it's documented. Then managing data focuses on what do you do with this information, how do you keep it up to date and consistent. Then we have your partners, who do you work with who also needs to have GDPR practices documented, which is pretty much all of them, and how do you ensure you are clear as to their practices and how they apply to you, and ensuring that they align with the approach that you've decided to take. Finally, sensitive and personal information is all of the data which provides that deeper personal insight into your contacts. How you capture this, whether you should do, and what you need to consider when you ask for and hold that data. For the 36 individual questions, there are also accompanying action points, which Helen is now going to talk about.
Yes, one of the things that we recognised when looking at the ICO self-assessment was that it was directed to a wide range of relevant organisations, whether commercial, public or third sector. Their suggestions of what to do next were very generic and therefore difficult to know how to put into practice or make use of. We think that a lack of relevant, clear and specific advice is reflected in a lot of GDPR self-assessments online. What we have sought to do in this self-assessment is to put down action points that are, first, specific to each activity that needs to be completed, and second, relevant to third sector organisations and our understanding of the particular challenges that such organisations are likely to have.
Okay, so what else is it? It's organisation agnostic. We didn't want to write something that only applied to fundraisers or only those dealing with membership data. GDPR doesn't solely focus in one sector or area of business, so it doesn't help if we do. However, it is written for the sector. We know there are specific areas of concern and focus for the NFP sector, and that's our sector, so we've considered that throughout with the examples provided. We've written this document knowing how confusing jargon, specific terms and various pieces of information regurgitated from other sources makes us feel. Where appropriate, and only in a handful of cases, have we linked to the ICO website or quoted them directly. It also aims to make you think about the aspects of your organisation, whether that's an association, a membership body or charity, and whatever your core themes are. It questions what you're doing, why, and whether you have carried out robust decision making in the process. And finally, it's free. We don't have any sections missing or reduced in detail to force you to pay or contact us. Yes, we do want to help you, but we also want you to be self-sufficient if you feel able to. Okay, so how do I use it? The first section of the document focuses on the table which you'll see in the example in front, and we suggest that you complete this on your own with colleagues or through an internal workshop or meeting. You could start going through this on your own and then follow up with meetings for specific areas or to review the initial outcomes. But essentially you're aiming to fill out the columns with either a yes, no or an unsure. Yes, only if you have checked and are 100% confident that you meet that requirement. No, if you are sure you don't meet that requirement. And unsure if you need to check further, which is maybe a follow-up with the individuals from a department or specific workshops and meetings to get into another layer of detail. If you are unclear as to what the questions mean, then you go to the action point section underneath each main area for more details. The action points relate directly to each question, and every single question has an action point. They provide further clarity regarding the question or a context or an example, to put that into context. They provide our recommendation as to the steps you need to take to meet that requirement, and they also contain links when needed to other ICO documentation, but we do avoid reciting large chunks of ICO text in favour of written clear English. So what do you do afterwards? Panic? No, you're now better informed, you know the challenges you face, your organisation's areas of strength and weakness, and you have clear action points to direct you to your next steps. It can be overwhelming to see the number of no's and unsures, but you will already be further ahead with your approach to GDPR than a lot of organisations in the sector. However, you must make an action plan. Making an action plan is simply about getting on with the job at hand. It's deciding, collating and documenting your organisation's processes and position on each element. Planning really is key, and even if you can't implement everything by May 2018, proving that you're working towards this and have thought about how and when to tackle each element will put you in a much stronger position.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Chris. Perhaps I can just use the last few moments of our webinar to direct those listening to some other next steps. The self-assessment that Chris has just been taking us through is available for download from our website at hartsquare.co.uk/GDPR. You are, of course, very welcome to call us, and our number is available on the website to arrange a free advice session. And at our TechSmart NFP event on November 28th, one-to-one sessions about GDPR can be arranged with our consultants. And again, do contact us through our website should you like to book a slot. Finally, we will be sending out a short survey to all those that have joined our webinar today. And that, of course, is in full compliance with the data protection statement provided at sign up. And we would be very grateful if you could take a couple of moments to return that, or indeed to update your consent for us to reach you. On behalf of Alan and Chris, may I say thanks very much for joining our webinar this afternoon, and we hope to see you at TechSmart in November.